Last month, my friend and former neighbor, Amy Nussbaum, and I had an incredible opportunity to talk about the work she's doing as a CPS parent, advocate for disability rights, and just her experience taking care of her kids, but also other parents and caregivers who don't necessarily have the means or the time she does. And so it is an incredible conversation. I hope you enjoy it. As the candidate for an elected school board position, this is how I am not talking about doing the work, but showing through my actions, doing the work by listening to others, bringing stories that matter to life, and helping educate others on the criticality of our public school system and how we can consistently do better. Please enjoy, and I would love to hear from you on what else you want to know about. And I've included links on how you can get to know things, and you have a really rich and full life. But one of the things that I thought was interesting is the experience that you're living and that your children are living through.
Yeah, well, I actually want to start with the point you made that you didn't know much about what is needed in disability rights and what's going on with Chicago Public Schools, which I think is really the main point, is that most people don't know what's going on with disability discrimination and accessibility because many people don't grow up surround with disabled classmates or someone who's disabled in their family. Someone who does grow up around disability knows very much about it, but that's so few and far between because systemically disabled people have been isolated and segregated from the general population. And that is what is happening in Chicago public schools, which is why most parents don't know that this is happening. Um, so what happened with my daughter is 6 now, she's in the first grade. Before she went to kindergarten, I enrolled her in a preschool part-time through Chicago Public Schools, in what is known in Chicago as a cluster program. So a cluster program is just a name Chicago Public Schools, for some reason, gave what is really a self-contained classroom. So one classroom completely filled with disabled children who are learning together. At this specific preschool, and I don't want to mention any names, but there were opportunities for inclusion. There were typical children who attended the school. But in my daughter Libby's classroom, it was only disabled children. Um, and I did not see um, much growth or as much growth as I would have liked to see from Libby in a cluster program from Chicago Public Schools. She came out of pre-K not even knowing the concept of what a letter was. She didn't know any letters. She didn't know any numbers. And what we see in these cluster programs or self-contained classrooms, not just in Chicago public schools, but all over the country, is that there are lower standards for our disabled students. There's lower expectations of what our disabled students can learn. And so they're not taught what they can actually learn or may learn. So it was really important for me that Libby attend a typical school where she's in a general education classroom and also receiving special education and special education supports at that school too.
Can I actually call a not a timeout, but I just want to interject for a minute. I think that's a really interesting comment. And before I do this, I do have 2 kids and they're in the background. And what is the classic? Like, no one talks to you until you pick up the phone type
Of course.
deal. Yeah. So we could do this. I could be in a closet right now and they'd be like, I need to get in this closet right now.
Of course.
Um, so I, s- I, I saw a video actually, and maybe it was a reel on, social media, but it was like, if you don't ask me to try harder, I won't try harder. If you don't expect me to learn more, I won't learn more. So like
Is this for
if you
Down
don't
syndrome?
raise the bar, what was that?
Did you see the latest Down syndrome ad for Down
Maybe
syndrome
maybe
Awareness Day?
that. Is it winning awards?
No, it was a woman with Down syndrome, and
Maybe it
she's
is.
like,
And
if you
she's like,
don't
if coach doesn't tell me to punch harder, then I won't punch
That's it.
harder. I
That's
just
it.
saw it and I went, wow,
Yeah.
that's so powerful because it's true. And that's how
Right.
I was raised by my parents and my coaches and my teachers, is to push me and raise the bar higher with the expectation of, what do they say? Like, shoot for the moon. And if you miss, don't worry, you're going to land on a star. Right.
Yeah.
And just that idea of like teaching kids that like we're going to set the bar high with the expectation that you're going to reach. It's called a reach goal. So, in what you just described, it sounds like your experience was you had a 3, 4 year old in a classroom and you didn't feel like there were reach goals
No.
and you wanted her to be experiencing, you know, higher expectations, whether she was reaching and exceeding them or not. You wanted her to know that there was more. Is that an accurate kind of
I want
summary?
her, yeah, I
Or you
want her
don't
to
know
know
her
there was
capacity or her potential because she wasn't getting fully stretched. Is that appropriate?
right.
Okay.
And I'm constantly being surprised by her too. So I'm her own mother, and I'm also surprised by the things that she's doing and the things that she's accomplishing, and it's a constant reminder to me to keep that bar high for her. Um, I, I think it also is necessary to have a complete 180 about how we view disability and disabled people in our world. Our parents' generation, or at least my parents' generation, when they were little kids, kids like my daughter Levy, institutionalized. Doctors were telling parents the best place for your child is an institution. If you really love them, if you really want what's best for them, you'll institutionalize them. I mean, that's what happened to Judy Human, who the protest that I organized, that who was memoriam of. Judy Human's parents, when she got polio and was to be in a wheelchair, the doctor said you should institutionalize her, and they said no. And so many disabled leaders of our country had parents that said no. And I don't say that to say that, the parents who said yes were bad parents. They honestly probably thought what they were doing what was best for their child. But so just the generation above us thought that that's what should happen to disabled people. Then my generation, I had some disabled students come and go out of my school. There'd be some story about a kid with Down syndrome at high school, but it was very few and far between. And now we're really moving towards a new space where disabled people should be completely involved in our communities, in our places of employment, in our schools. And I mean, laws were written to make that such in the 1970s. But as you know, with most civil rights, it takes a long time for people to adjust and for things to actually change. Um, but I really see that to be true with Lily, is that she, her individual needs were not looked at. Chicago Public Schools just said, oh, this child has a disability, so they belong in a cluster program. Um,
Can I ask a follow-up question on that as well?
yeah,
Do you think, and I don't know the answer to this, and this is something as someone who's actively like running for the Board of Education and CPS, this is maybe my homework, right? But because I'll be responsible, accountable for this. But is it, if we keep the bar low, then people will achieve them and our metrics look good? You know what I mean? Like, is that like, why would, what would be the outcome of doing that? Like, what is the goal of not teaching these skills, of not stretching students? Do you think it is
sure,
like, I mean,
sure.
do you think
It's
there's some like
cheaper.
make the metric achievable because then they can say every student coming out of these cluster programs has met all expectations of the programs?
Yeah. So what was different about, the disability rights movement in the 1970s? It was really asking the country to spend a lot of money, right? It costs money to make
Yeah.
all buses ADA compliant, to make all train stations ADA compliant, to make all buildings ADA compliant. That costs a lot of money. And the same is true for Chicago Public Schools. It is cheaper and easier to have these select cluster programs, these self-contained classrooms, in only some schools, because then they only have to resource those classrooms. as opposed to making every neighborhood school accessible for every student, whether they're in a wheelchair or they have an intellectual disability, that costs so much more money to put those resources and to make sure the buildings are ADA compliant for every building. Now, over a long period of time, it's actually cheaper because the amount of money our country needs to spend on what happens to disabled people when they're not cared for by society ends up being very expensive. But if we actually just cared for each other as
Right.
equals, in the long run, it's actually cheaper.
Right. And I'm assuming also, I'm very much making an assumption, but it's similar to what happens with the math with women, right? It's actually lost income earning potential because if we're
Yeah,
not actually investing in individuals who can add to society, then we're
right.
actually like, not realizing, additional growth potential or solutions that have never been brought to the world because we didn't make that small investment that would have had positive results down the line.
Yes. I mean, and
Yeah.
I even see that on such a micro level within my own family. Like Libby's presence in our family has made us such a better family, has made me such a better mom for all of my kids, has made me a better friend to people around me. So, even just on that one example, I know that including disabled people in all facets of our society is beneficial for everyone.
I want to ask you because you've had in advocating for your daughter, you've taken that experience, you learned because you're very connected. And I think this is very much, I don't want to say a Lakeview thing. I've lived in a lot of neighborhoods in Chicago. I've also had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people in other neighborhoods in Chicago. This is maybe a Chicago Midwest thing. I think every neighborhood is hyper connected. So
Yeah.
you've also met other people who have had similar experiences. So I'm assuming that's why you went from, oh, I'm advocating for my child to, okay, now I'm sending, now this just got bigger. So do you
Oh,
want to
yeah.
share out how the realization that you said, "Oh, this is systemic. This isn't just this isolated incident." Like, what are some of the things that you heard from other parents as you started down your journey and going, and what did other parents say to you that were farther
You
down the line of like, "Oh yeah, I think you told me some of these, right? They left." Can you share a bit of like what other people have
Yeah,
experienced?
you will never meet a parent with a disabled child who says like, "No, everything is so great at our school. Everything no, we've never had one problem. Everything's so great." That will never ever happen. So, what a lot of parents experience with their disabled children is that the actual disabled child is so wonderful and they love their child so much and they see all that is great and amazing about that child. And then every system around that child is a nightmare, whether it's insurance or whether it's school or whether it's the playground or whether it's just going out into the community and having to deal with people staring or saying things or, all of that is a nightmare. But the actual child is never the burden themselves. It's everything around that makes it difficult. Um, my puppy's not playing with a rock. Is it loud?
I can't hear a thing.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah. Can you hear
I
my
got the
two
kids
boys
away.
playing like football
I
down the
can't.
hallway? Okay,
No,
great.
I can't hear your voice. Okay. Kids, I did not think of the puppy. Um. So I talk to a lot of parents all of the time, especially being on the board for Williams Syndrome Association, and then just being in Chicago and talking to other parents from Chicago. And everything is difficult always to get your child's needs supported. Um, And so, yes, if families can and want to, they do move to the suburbs where it is much easier. Not to say it's like no problem out there, but it is so much easier to get your child's needs met and get your child's needs met peacefully at many schools in the suburbs. And Chicago Public Schools has a reputation for being a disaster when it comes to special education. And I'm finding that to be very much the case. Um, so when Libby was ready for kindergarten, well, before she was ready, I went to our neighborhood school and had a meeting with the assistant principal there. And she said, we don't have the resources for Libby here. Like, this would not be a good place to send her. And that is illegal. Your neighborhood school needs to provide the appropriate accommodations and supports for any child that goes there. But what happens is, um, and I could have sent her without her having the needs and supports. But if I had a child in a wheelchair, I really couldn't have sent her. So there's a difference there. And I wasn't going to send my child to a school who was basically telling me, like, don't send her here. Um, so we got lucky enough to be lotteried into a magnet school, and it's a highly ranked lottery school. And so I thought we like won the golden ticket. I couldn't believe it. Libby got into the school. This is going to be great. They're, you know, they achieve such wonderful academics there. They really challenge kids there. This is going to be fantastic. And I thought it was fantastic because I hadn't heard otherwise. And Libby was safe there, and she's happy there, and she's still very safe there. She's very loved at her school. She's learning at her school. Um, she's not learning as much as she could be, or really learning appropriately, but that's a different subject. So when she started in kindergarten, I thought things were going really well. And then just a couple months into kindergarten, they called me in for an IEP meeting and blindsided me and told me they were recommending a placement change, which is just a fancy way of saying we're kicking your daughter out of the school and we're throwing her into a cluster program. When that happens to parents, they have 10 days to appeal it. And what you really need to appeal it is a lawyer. And if you want to win the appeal. And so, our city, most parents either financially cannot afford a lawyer, don't know that they even need a lawyer, don't really understand or know that they have only 10 days to jump on this. I mean, there's so many things that they don't have the bandwidth because most parents are working one or two jobs and they have children and one of them is disabled. It's a lot to deal with. It's
Yeah.
like a second job. So I just always felt that I was very fortunate that I could hire a lawyer, that I had the bandwidth, that I had the resources, that I had some background and the capacity to learn more special education law, that it really made me think we need to get the word out there that Chicago Public Schools is doing this, and parents have more rights for their children that they're maybe aware of.
Who did you have to appeal to? The school, the network principal? Like, where does the appeal process go to, at a board?
So the district, and then they get the district lawyers involved, and you can try to have mediation before it goes to due process. And Chicago Public Schools very much wanted to mediate with us. um, I think it's because they knew what they did was extremely illegal, to kick a child out due to her disability um, with no substantial evidence for why she should be kicked out of that school. 2 months into kindergarten as a 5-year-old nonverbal intellectually disabled child. So we settled in mediation and she got to stay at her current school.
And to your point, I mean, I have a spouse, him and I both have jobs, we have 2 kids, and I can't imagine, in addition to all that, like, needing to realize we need to get a lawyer and, manage this process. And to your point about individuals in Chicago who maybe don't have a partner, don't have the financial means, have a child that has, just extra care needed and wherever they are in their learning journey. I mean, it's not necessarily an accessible issue. Even if
Right.
they knew they needed it, not everyone can afford it or find a lawyer in time. That's not a lot of
Yeah.
time to find an appropriate attorney to even do a response. It's pretty significant.
Yeah. And I think what's also a really big issue for any parent um, is that to be an advocate for your disabled child, or your neurodivergent child is to be somewhat confrontational. And most parents don't want to have a confrontational relationship with anyone at their child's school, including me. I was a teacher for years before I had children. I come from a very educational family. I would love to have nothing but a warm and collaborative and supportive relationship with my children's school. I'm the mom who wants to be chaperoning the field trips and throwing the party in the classrooms and being the room parent and being, that parent the teacher can call if she needs anything. But when you're the parent of a kid with an IEP or a 504, it becomes a very big balancing act of like what you feel you can ask for, when you feel you can really put your foot down on things, you know, sometimes being confrontational and calling things out. And it's very uncomfortable and difficult for most parents to be that person. And so a lot of parents just say, I don't know. I don't know. And also because we don't know. Sometimes we don't know what is the most appropriate thing or the best thing for our child because we don't know who they're going to be either. So it's like in everyone's best interest to work together, but for many reasons there's just this contentious relationship between school and home for so many families, that is really unfortunate.
Yeah, and to your point, the kids are usually the ones who are doing they're good, right? Like, to
Yeah.
your point, like, the kid is the spark of love and joy and light, and it's the
Yes.
adults who are struggling getting it together.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I had a parent, um, say, who has seen Libby at the school because she's been in the school building quite a lot. And she said, I really think you should be happy with Libby at this school. Someone's always with her and they really love her there. And I thought, that's part of the problem. Like, I can't just go through life being happy with someone taking care of my child who needs care. Um, I need people to, especially at her place of learning, to be teaching her, to be educating her. So I'm not just going to settle with someone's always there with her. And also, um, these are paid professionals. So no one's doing me any favors there. This is their job. They're getting paid to do this. It's a very difficult job, really difficult, very stressful, time consuming. I'm sure it takes over most teachers' lives to do what they do if they're doing it well. But it's not a favor we're asking to do for our children. It's their job.
There was I think I told this to you, and I finally found it. Her name was Brooke Ellison. I'll email you this article. Her article and obituary was in the New York Times on February 9th this year. So she was paralyzed from the neck down in a car accident and died when she was 45 this year. So in 1990, she was a very active kid, um, karate, soccer, cello, dance, and then in 1990 she was struck by a car. And after 6 weeks in the hospital, um, her mom was like, "We are gonna give her a life," and they couldn't accommodate her, and so her mom essentially went to school with her every day to be the hand that Brooke couldn't raise.
Yep, I remember
And
this.
yes, and it's amazing, and then this woman went on to go to Harvard and
Hmm.
teach and write books and like live a really productive life. But it reminds me of parents and a lot of times women and moms who take on these roles of advocates and be like, I want my kid to learn. Like the Helen Keller story, right? Like I need my kid to be a functioning adult. What's going to happen when I'm not here? Who's going to look after them? I need them to function. I will go in there and raise their hand when they can't raise it to
Yeah,
put them in the room and create space for them. But I need a system that allows them to flourish and find support when, to your point, like this world doesn't necessarily take care of people.
yeah.
Did I say
Yeah.
that back to you correctly? Does that connect with you, or would you want to add
Yeah.
anything into that?
Um, no, and I'm getting distracted by it because there's this new book I'm reading. I can't remember the author's name. It's by a disabled woman. It's called Care Work. And I didn't know this world existed within the disability world where there are many people of color and part of the LGBTQ community who are disabled that really rely on these care webs they form because they can't rely on state given care um, for multitude of reasons. And so they do actually rely on favors from people and care within their communities. And it's a completely different um, way of thinking than I have done with Libby, where I keep thinking um, in Judy Human terms, where you set laws and then laws are made and then the state or the government or and the person in this profession gives you X, Y, and Z. But I think both can exist. We can care for a society as just humans while also creating law that require certain professionals to care for disabled people too.
What's it called? Care work?
Care work, yeah.
Okay. Um, and I appreciate you calling that out. Like, we can acknowledge that, like, you and I are both white women, and in that carry some privilege, and also live
Yeah.
in a neighborhood that allows us some privilege. And to be anything other than that, a person of color in a community that's LGBTQ plus, um, also just adds a whole other layers to that experience that just continues to make it harder to get care. And so I like the idea of forming, I don't want to call them alternative because that creates an other, but if the system, the standard system or the state isn't going to take care of you, creating systems in place, right?
Yeah.
Right, like community
Yeah.
based systems, which might actually be more effective. While they should actually have funding and not have to do that, it sounds like those organic systems of care might actually be supportive and homegrown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and speaking of people of color, Levy being black and female, statistically, she has a very high chance of being abused or sexually abused by someone. So, I get this question a lot. Why would I want to keep sending her to this school that tried kicking her out after 2 months into kindergarten? And now in first grade, they gave her straight Fs the first quarter of her first grade year, which I've since learned is a very common tactic that Chicago Public Schools does when they don't want your child in that school. So why would I want to keep sending her to the school that feels like they keep wanting to push her out? And it's because I know she's safe there and I know she's loved there. And her three siblings go there, and it's 5 blocks from my home. And so, right now, for my little girl who's only 6, that comes before, okay, well, are they following her IEP as they should be? She could be learning to read a lot more than she's learning, but they're not doing that. I can't, it's not right now. And I don't know how long this perspective will last for me, but her safety and care there is going to trump her education there. And now because I have the safety and care that exists at the school, I am now pushing for the education to come through. I can't, I know how hard it is to come by a school that's so accepting towards and I say that and mean like the students too. The students in Levy's class and at her school are very loving and very warm and accepting of her. And their parents are too. So I can't just walk away from that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's everything has a different weight of importance at different times.
Yes.
I understand that.
Yeah.
I can absolutely understand that. Where did you grow up? What state or city?
I grew up in Deerfield, just north of Chicago.
Oh yeah. So I think we talked about this. I grew up in Addison. I went to a private Catholic school, and we had breakout groups. So we would have like a core lesson and then we'd have breakout groups depending on like learning differences and where you had progress. So you were able to say like if you weren't getting this area very good, like they kind of say like, okay, these three kids were struggling. So like you three, let's go and do a breakout group. You're getting it. So like you three can go move on. So like we would do core learning and then based on like subject area, we would constantly do like breakout sub learning. And so I'm not sure about different learning disabilities within that school, but I do know we had a lot of like breakout time to like help with individualized learning patterns. I do know when I went to the public high school, which was much bigger, much more diverse, right? Uh, we had the best buddies program. And that was probably my first exposure to people with physical and intellectual different learning differences.
Yeah.
Um, and the Best Buddies program was incredible. And it's interesting because I live in, Chicago now, and we're going to be here and raise our kids here and go to CPS here. And they're younger, so maybe this exists. But does Best Buddies do programs like that exist? Is that still
Yeah.
around? That's
Yeah.
awesome. I really like it. It's so
Best Buddies is
cool.
still around. Yeah. Yeah, they're less. And actually, my oldest son, a seventh grader, does. It's not Best Buddies, but it's very much like that. He goes on Sundays to a workout facility, and typical kids and disabled kids can work out together for about an hour. Yeah, but
That's
that,
cool.
and that's great, and that's great that that exists. But that, my ultimate
Doesn't
dream
yes, yeah.
is that we don't need programs like that because all kinds of people are just part of our everyday society, and kids don't need these opportunities to be exposed to disabled kids,
Yeah.
and disabled kids don't need this opportunity to be exposed to typical kids. And just in Levy's short little
Hmm.
life, I mentioned how she didn't even know the concept of a letter coming out of this cluster program. Being it's being in a general education placement for 1 year in kindergarten and now about a half year in first grade, she is a different child. She knows all of her letters. She knows all of the sounds of her letters.
Yeah.
She's starting to put 3-letter words together and starting to learn how to read. Her growth for like emotionally and socially has gone through the roof. I mean, what she's now able to do and her regulation skills are blowing us away because she's around all of these typically developing children and she's able to look at them and learn.
Yeah. And
And just
model
like,
and look up to
yeah,
them. Yeah.
yeah,
So you went to the Board of Education, one of the committees, right? I don't know
special
the official.
education,
Okay.
special education advisory committee.
Okay. And that's something that is, if people can find it and have the time and all the what have yous,
Yeah,
generally open to the public. And then if you want to have a how does that work? If you want to have a speaking slot, you sign up. Um, or the
yeah.
committees, was that harder for you?
So apparently it's new this year. It's very new, this special education advisory committee. I only learned of it from a man named Frank Lally, who works for education for Access Living. Access Living is a very large and formative and amazing disability organization. He let me know of that meeting, and I went online because you have to register. I think you have to register to be in attendance in person there, and you definitely have to register to be a speaker. There are only 5 spots, at least right now. There are only 5 spots available, and they give you 3 minutes to speak. And it's the same for our general Board of Education meetings. You have to register to speak. I think they only give you 2 minutes at the general education board meeting.
That's correct.
And
Yeah.
I think that they meet quarterly. I'm not sure
The
about that though.
the board meets monthly. The big board
Oh,
meets monthly. Yeah.
okay.
Um, but did you end up speaking at the last one or just attending?
I did.
You spoke.
I spoke. Yes.
Yes. And can you share a little bit about what you shared? Shared what you
Sure.
shared? Yeah.
I had to cut down my speech a lot
Yeah.
because I
That's
knew I
typically
only
what
got a few
happens
minutes.
when you get 3 minutes and they do cut people off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my whole speech was about like 7 minutes long, and I thought maybe they're not serious about the time. And then when I got there and saw they were serious, I had to like cut stuff out. But I was able to submit the whole speech online to the committee to read in full, which is great. Um, but I discussed the whole concept of cluster programs and how it's cheaper and easier for the district to do that, but it really is segregating and isolating and discriminating against our disabled students, and how each neighborhood school should be outfitted and resourced for any child that lives in that neighborhood and should and can attend that school. And how the protest brought about information from Chicago Public Schools through a Sun-Times journalist who asked them how many of their buildings were ADA compliant. And they said one third were ADA compliant, one third first floor ADA compliant, and one third were not ADA compliant at all, which is really saying 2/3 of their school, 2/3 are not ADA compliant. Because what is a student or parent or teacher going to do on just the first floor of a school building? That's not ADA compliant. That child cannot really attend school there if they can only be on the first floor. Um, so it's really astonishing that Chicago Public Schools has gotten away with this lawlessness for so long when these laws have been written into place for decades. Um, Whether it's because their school buildings are not ADA compliant for wheelchairs, or because they're segregating intellectually disabled or autistic children or neurodivergent children and putting them all together in the self-contained classroom, or not meeting the IEPs of all students. Some students require a SIGA, which is like a one-on-one aid throughout the school day, and there's a shortage of SIGAs. And even the SIGAs that we do have are not being treated fairly. So at this special education advisory committee I spoke at, um, a group for SICAs represented there and spoke first. And Chicago Public Schools is using SICAs for a vast amount of reasons at these schools: lunch duty, covering for teachers, when their duty is to be with the child they're assigned to who has it written into their IEP that they have a dedicated SICA throughout the day. So there's just laws being broken left and right. Um, and yes, part of it is because it's very difficult and it's expensive, but that is not an excuse. And
Yeah.
what needs to be done is just this constant talks like this and awareness, and then um, disability organizations like Equip for Equality and Access Living and Raise Your Hand Illinois, Raise Your Hand Chicago, to really be doing more about it. And they are constantly working on these things, but it just takes time.
That's awesome. I'm it's I think that the interesting part is, and I read the book Normal Sucks, and like when we post this, I'll have like links to the books and the resources that we shared. But I think honestly, as we all kind of get older and we live in this amazing time, like I'm probably neurodivergent. Like there is no normal, right? We
Yeah,
all are unique learners. And I think it's awesome as, 50 years ago, we'd be like, yeah, but that's not my kid, so it's not my problem. And now I hope that people can listen to this and go like, that actually could be my kid. So we should all kind of care because I think we're one kid or very like 1 degree away. If it's not our kid, we know someone very closely to us that has someone that has a learning difference, like somewhere
yeah,
on that degree of what, like some kind of unique learning plan where this can be affected. Right. Or your kid just breaks a leg, and you're like, oh wow,
yeah,
wow, what if my kid ended up really breaking a leg? How would they get to class? Run that through your head. It's like,
right,
oh yeah, no, they can't. Um,
right,
yes, like that's a whole other conversation about, facilities in a school. And yeah, that's maybe not your job, Amy, but that's someone's job. Like there's an actual job. There's people that have been employed since the 1970s whose job it is to have to figure this out. High
yeah,
rises have figured it out, apartment buildings figure it out. This is what we
right,
do.
right.
Um,
And
is
and
this
I
yeah.
will say that Chicago, a lot of disability organizations in Chicago and Mayor Johnson's office wants Chicago to be the most accessible city in the country. And I can't see how we're going to get there if Chicago Public Schools is segregating and isolating these children who are disabled. Then, you know, the impact it has on those disabled children, along with the impact it has on these typically developing children, how are we supposed to increase disability employment opportunities if they're being segregated and isolated? How are we supposed to increase disability learning outcomes if they're segregated with lower standards? I mean, you can't have something be the best in the country if the educational foundation is not there.
Yeah. So if you had, I don't know, one thing you can, let's say, because I'm sure this is going to be the most watched video in the history of time.
Yeah.
One thing that you can tell um, parents watching this right now, right? Like make it very easy. Like what's one thing that they can do today? I have one thing in my head, but I'm going to let you go first. Um, what's one thing they can do today? Is it, do you have a petition that they can sign? Is it a question that they can ask? Is it an article or a book they can read? Like what's something that someone can do to, or a question that they can ask? Like what's something someone can do to say, wow, okay, I get it. I moved. Like what can I do? I can't quit my job. Like what can I do? Like, what is that next step?
Uh, okay, well, I think for a more global understanding of
Yeah,
disability rights,
yeah.
I would highly suggest reading Judy Heuman's memoir
Okay.
and giving your children her young adult version of her memoir. So there's two different versions of Judy Heumann. And then watching Crip Camp. It was produced by the Obamas, and it's a film, a documentary on how Judy Heumann and her friends and colleagues created the disability rights movement in the 1970s. So I would get your hand on those books. I would watch the movie Crip Camp. And then I would sign our petition. I'm trying to think of the easiest way to give that. It's in my Instagram bio.
Yeah, we'll have
It
a
is
link here. Like in
okay.
in this video, there's something in the bottom or there'll be a button right here we can click and sign it. Yep.
Okay, that would be very helpful. But I think even in addition to those things, on a more local level, if so many people called district office and said, "My school doesn't have accessibility for wheelchairs. Why not? Where are all the kids with Down syndrome? How come I don't have any kids with Down syndrome in my school? Where are all the autistic kids? Where are these kids with autism? Where are they being taught?" And just started to ask those questions and demand answers from the district. I don't know. That may put some pressure on them.
Those are really good suggestions.
We'll
Yeah.
see.
After I got your email, I was in our school and um and I did ask the question. I was like, "Hey, how would someone like if my kid broke his leg, like how would he get upstairs aside from like army crawling up the stairs?"
Yeah,
And so I think also one other idea is like go to email your LSC, like have an office hours with your minister and just ask the question even at like an even more local level and just ask the school and be like, "Where like how does this work here?"
yeah,
And I'm
and
sure your principal administration, like to that point that Amy made, like at some level, their hands are tied at the local level. Like they don't build the building, right? It's not
right,
like they can run a construction project, but they'll give you the honest truth of like, oh,
right,
we actually have an accessible door over here. Or like, oh, we did have a student and like they would go, like they'll give you the logistical answer. And then I think that'll start to get to send you on that path, or at least have your eyes open of what if you did have a child that came into your care or a neighbor's child or your child became disabled, right? Like the woman that we talked about got hit by a car. She became a quadriplegic. Accidents happen. What
right.
happens to your kid? Ask the question.
Yes. And I mean, I will quote Judy Heumann, I'm sure, for the rest of my life, or come
Yes.
close to quoting her because it's not going to be verbatim. Because she really is just, I look up to her so much. Um, but she said, you know, she would call people non-disabled because the chance of you becoming disabled in your life is so high that you need to be thinking this way. If you're not going to be thinking about this way for just society and the people in life and maybe in your family or your neighbor, think about it for yourself, because the chances of you becoming disabled are very high. Because most people, when they get older, become disabled in some way. If they're not born disabled or become disabled through accident, when you become a certain age, become an elderly person, you become disabled often.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's for everyone. And she also, a lot of ADA compliancy helps everyone. Like the amount of times I've been on the elevator with my kid in a stroller and have been able to take the train around Chicago because of elevators is because of ADA compliancy. Like
Absolutely.
on all of our movies that we're all now reading at the bottom of our screens instead of just listening is ADA compliancy. We all love, I mean, not we all, but like so
We
many
do.
people know to
Yeah.
read the subtitles. Yeah.
Over 70% of videos watched online now are watched on mute with closed captioning.
Yeah.
People love closed captions. And
Yeah.
schools are community centers, right? They're
Right.
voting centers, they're community centers, they're gathering spaces, they're
Yes.
pillars of our communities, and they could be done more so if and when they become more accessible for all peoples.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Amy, this is so awesome. Uh, I don't want to say that the universe makes things happen and that God micromanages, but I'm hoping that there is, light and joy in your journey and that you have been able to channel your parental rage into something that will change the life for your daughter and a lot of other kids and parents who don't have the energy, time, or means to do the fight, right? And that's what it takes. Right? It's not
Yeah.
that others don't feel this, it's that you have a place to do the work and you're doing the work, and that's really amazing. And you've
Thank you.
learned and you're really like you're articulate in sharing it. Um, and I continue to need to be educated and learn and I'm gonna do that work. And so I really appreciate you emailing me back, sending the email, emailing me back, answering my questions, and yeah, taking care of your
Yeah.
daughter. That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'll say it again and again that the light and joy is Libby herself. And I appreciate you wanting to learn more, because the only things around disability, another human quote, is disability itself is not a tragedy. It's only a tragedy when the world around us doesn't support them. And so you taking the steps to understand and do better and to implement that possibly, hopefully, on the Board of Education is huge. So thank you.
Thank you so much.